kyo katamskad now. Asemina mustaki bote tipskami kingeton nistanoski. Ipewichi hai kahkyo totemnog exkinanaskum na. I just applaud you tonight for your milestone accomplishment for all of our peoples, your 20th anniversary, for the outstanding work that you do for all of us. So thank you for that. Yes, my name is Willie, but also my name is number 65. For 14 years, I went to 3 different residential schools. And I recall a day, actually, I was dropped off on a team of horses at a residential school. And like many, we're all students who shared their stories with us about the first day, about when your name was taken and replaced with a number. 65, come here. Or 65, pick up that pencil, stupid. 65, why did you do that, idiot? So what happens to a child when you do that as they're growing up? And indeed, what happens to the parents from whom you've taken their children? Many parents told us, I couldn't stand the pain of losing my child because I couldn't do anything about protecting my child. I remember one woman said to us, as I was listening, she said, the last thing I remember about my little girl, I was hanging on to her with both hands tightly, and RCMP took one arm away. Indian agent took the other one away. Mr. Commissioner, that's the last time I saw my little girl. You go find her, she said. Big challenge. Indeed, I didn't want to do this work. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. As you know, it's unique in the world for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the first Truth Commission in the world that's been ordered by courts. Usually, governments create truth commissions themselves. This one wasn't. It's been classed as the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian legal history. It's also been told that it's the darkest, saddest, most unknown chapter in Canadian history, the residential school history. So I didn't want to do it myself. I thought, well, I'm too busy. I've got my law practice. I'm working very hard. And if you remember, the first 3 commissioners all resigned. And a second call came out for people to serve on the commission. And of course, I was phoned and I said, no, I don't want to do it. I remember the woman said, well, it's part-time. Maybe a third of your time, maybe. So I said, well, if it's part-time, put my name in the hat. And I didn't hear from anyone for months until one morning, early morning, I was in Geneva at the United Nations, where this month I'll be 40 years working at the UN. Anyway, my phone rang. My phone rang and a voice at the other end said, Mr. Littlechild? I said, yes. Willie. Oh, I'm sorry, did I wake you up? I said, well, yeah, it's 2 o'clock in the morning here, because I was in Geneva with the 8-hour difference. And she said, well, the minister is going to make an announcement that you're one of the 3 new commissioners. Do you have anything to say? I said, well, not at this particular time, no. And she said, oh, by the way, it's full time. Click. So I was in. But what a blessing it's been. What an amazing, amazing blessing. It's also probably, well, not probably, For me, it was the most difficult job to undertake. Going across Canada for 6 years, listening to adults in their children's voice, telling us about what happened to them in residential school. Some very angry about what happened to them. Some said, you know, I've been hiding this story for 60 years, 50 years. My children don't know what happened to me. So this was a unique commission. It was unique not only because it was established by the courts, but it's the first one that has been funded by the survivors. A little known fact in Canada, and indeed the world. It was survivors themselves that funded it. They felt it was important to fund it because when you ask people to settle a case out of court, you know that you're taking away their opportunity to present their side of the story. So the survivors said, no, we can't do that. We need this story to be known in Canada. So they said, we will fund it. But also, it's the most unique in a sense of cultural relevance. I met with 2 commissioners from the South African Commission, most world famous commission. And you know what they said? They said, we wish we had done it your way. I said, what do you mean? You're the most world famous Truth Commission. They said, yes, but yours was safe. It was culturally relevant. And it was because the elders told us, don't listen to anyone unless they're in a safe setting. Make sure that there's a medical support available. Make sure that there's cultural support available. And make sure, most importantly, that there's spiritual support around the individual before you ask them to tell you their story. So we followed that advice. So when I think back about a journey on the Truth Commission, I need to think back further about the United Nations. Because today is National Aboriginal Day. But this morning I was talking to students at high school about the Truth Commission. And I recalled that it's so important that we look within ourselves. Because in a way, there's a long line of events. The one I want to relate to you, connected with today, was that at the United Nations, the Chief Victor Buffalo, my brother, was there with me along the way. We debated for 8 years on one letter. One letter. The debate was whether we should have the letter S added on to the word people. 8 years there was resistance. So I came back one day, met with the elders as I always did after the meetings. And I said, yes, I just came back from Geneva again. And just to update you, we're still battling recognition. I said they were not wanting to recognize us as peoples. And one of the elders says, well, why not? What are we then? Are we a herd of elk or deer, moose? What are we? And I said, well, they want to call us groups, societies, ethnic minorities, populations, but they don't want to call us peoples. And he said, I know why, he said. Because if they recognize us as peoples, they have to admit we're human beings. And if they admit we're human beings, they have to admit that we have human rights. I said, wow, this elder, he didn't go to law school. He didn't even go to school, I don't think. But he hit it right on the head. He saw through all that 8 years of argument. So today, Prime Minister announced they're changing the name of today. I'm sure you heard it. From now on, it's going to be National Indigenous Peoples Day. National Indigenous Peoples Day. And I reflect on that journey, the 8 years we argued over that one letter, how significant today is from that perspective. And it reminds me also that we argued for 27 years, the longest debated UN declaration in history. It took us 27 years to get the UN declaration adopted at the UN. Now why? Why would it take that long? What were the reasons for not wanting to recognize us as human beings? So in our work, after hearing many people, we decided that this is not an ordinary truth commission. This is not a report that'll be filed with a list of recommendations. So we decided, because when groups are asked to do a study and report back, certain words are used: conclusions, suggestions, observations, recommendations. And actually a study was done on what is the easiest word to ignore in the report when it's done. The easiest word to ignore is recommendation. Recommendations. So we said, we've had enough studies, we've had enough recommendations. I did a study myself in Saskatchewan on the justice system, how to improve the justice system as it affects First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I decided I was going to only have 8 conclusions, 8 at the time recommendations. But the important thing was concluding that we have enough studies, we have enough reports, we have enough recommendations. What we need now is action. So you'll see our report has as an individual. You know, this morning we buried one of our brothers at a residential school. And of all the, perhaps now between 8,000 and 9,000 stories I've heard individually, his words come to me often. When he told me one time, we had a reunion of residential school in Muskochis, the Ermineskin School. And he came to me during the meeting, during noon hour, and he said, you know, Willie, I've been working on reconciliation for 20 years. No, I'm sorry, 10 years, he said. So I said, Ray, that's very good. Gee, that's really good. He said, no, Willie. Today was the first day I realized reconciliation starts with me. Reconciliation begins with me. So I tell about him across the country often because of its message. So which one of the calls speaks to you? Well, I think there's one specific call that speaks to you. But it's such a great day, for example, and there's already backlash happening. Prime Minister also said he was going to change the name of Langevin block. You all know that Langevin was the one that introduced the residential school policy. And Prime Minister decided to change the name of that building to the Prime Minister and Privy Council office, taking the word Lanjame out of it, or the name associated with residential schools. And there's already an outcry about that. But he also, I'm sure you all know Ottawa. In front of the Parliament buildings, there's a building right straight across, directly south of it. It used to be the US Embassy. It's 100 Wellington. It used to be a United States Embassy until they moved to their new one. It's been sitting empty since. And we had made a call that there should be a place in Ottawa to honor the residential school students, to make a national center. After all, there's not two founding nations in Canada, we said. There's not two orders of government. There's indeed three orders of government. And there should be a place for that. And they converted that building today for a national center going forward for Indigenous peoples. Very significant location. These are actions that happen today that are really significant in my view. So the courts told us, you must tell the complete history of residential schools. And I think we've done that. One of the things they did not tell us to do was to answer the question, not only about the child taken, or the parents left behind, or the children that came after. What about those that did not come home? What happened to the missing children? We heard many times sad stories, because children often try to run away from residential school. Story about children picked up on a float plane after being paddled to the float plane. And excited because first time they've been on a plane as little children. And as the plane took off, they're looking out the window and they see their parents on the shore, getting smaller and smaller and smaller until they couldn't see their parents. Many of them, it would be the last time they'd see their parents. So they go to Ottawa on a plane, then they're put on a train for 3 days and 3 nights to this city, to Edmonton. Then they're put on another plane and they're flown to Inuvik Residential School, 2,500 miles away. Don't forget that these were children. So yes, some of them try to run away, but how do you run away when your home is 2,500 miles away? Mine was only 3 miles away, and I thought it was a long way, a long distance. So children died trying to cross a river. They drowned. Children died because they froze to death, running away in the middle of winter. There's a picture etched in my mind of 4 little boys discovered in the bush. And you could tell they were probably trying to keep each other warm. But they lost their way in the bush and they froze to death. And they were found that way. There was a school not far from here, by the Red Deer River. And through ceremony recently, the grave site, they excavated or exhumed some of the grave site because it was discovered by a farmer in a field where the residential school used to be. And in one grave, there's 3 little skeletons, one on top of the other. We don't know who those children were. You see, for us, it's very important, as you know, that we identify the connection within family. So today, we bury a student. Tomorrow, there'll be a feast. Last 3 nights, there was a wake. Today, they sang 16 traveling songs for his spirit on his journey. Then there'll be a feast every year today to mark his life. See, these ceremonies could not be done by families who didn't know where their children were. They didn't know where they were buried. They didn't know how they died. But by the time we were finished with our work, we've uncovered 4,300 children who died at these schools. And it's ongoing work. It's now as high as 6,000, I'm told. So, what do we do with these stories? What do we do with this truth that we've uncovered? Well, we take it now and we shape, or try to shape, what reconciliation needs to look like. What is reconciliation? I was telling the students this morning, we're so blessed in my community that our neighbor city, probably the most mispronounced city in Canada, I always say. You may know it as Wetaskiwin. But Wetaskiwin is actually a Cree word, Wetaskiwin. Wetaskiwin means having good relations. Having good relations. That's what reconciliation is. So what does that mean to you? Well, I look at the call 92. I'm just going to read it quickly with you, because my hip is complaining. I was told after I broke my hip playing last year, hockey, Willie, you better quit, you're getting too old. So, here's call to action 92, and see if it speaks to you. We call upon the corporate sector, that's you, both for profit and not for profit corporate sector in Canada, to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework, and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and corporate operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but it's not limited to, the following: commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. It's a very fundamental treaty principle as well. Secondly, ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and educational opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Thirdly, provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the UN Declaration, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. That's the call to you, your organizations, to adopt the UN Declaration as a framework for reconciliation. You know, when we released the report The Secretary General of the United Nations made a statement. He called on the world to look at the UN Declaration as a roadmap for the future. Shortly after, the High Commissioner for Human Rights also called on the world to implement these calls to action, because they weren't only speaking to Canada, they were speaking to the world. So that's the challenge we have. How do we, as private corporate industry, working with Indigenous peoples, how do we promote reconciliation with each other in our work? We're asking non-Indigenous corporations to do that, yes. And you know what? Many of them are stepping up. I've been asked to address boards in the city of Calgary, executive directors, presidents of corporations, wanting to know what they could do to promote and implement reconciliation. So we need to look at ourselves as well. I told Raymond's story this morning when he acknowledged that after 10 years, he finally realized that reconciliation starts with me. So how do we improve relations through the corporate sector? Is there such a thing as economic reconciliation? Is there such a thing as reconciliation through economic development? And I leave that with you. How do we restore respectful relationships in this country through the private sector, through business relationships, through economic development? And I know with your history, when you look back the 20 years you've journeyed, you've been doing that anyway along the way. But now we have a different situation. We also said reconciliation is going to take political will. You know, when we started on this work, Victor and I, we looked at each other at the UN a few times. One time we said to each other, you know what, we should invite the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come to the reserve. And Victor said, should we? I said, yeah, let's try it. So I introduced him at the UN as the head of state for Samson Cree Nation, the chief. Because at the time, the High Commissioner said, well, you know, I can't go. Government has to be the one to invite me. So I introduced Victor. I said, he's the chief of Samson Cree Nation, the government of the Samson members. I said, oh, well, if you put it that way. And sure enough, she came. So during one of the debates on the UN, we said, you know, we're talking about treaties in this drafting. Wouldn't it be nice to have a UN meeting on treaty territory? So again, we invited the UN. The first time they ever left Geneva, Switzerland, to hold a United Nations meeting outside of Geneva, and it was on his territory, Samson Cree Nation, an official United Nations meeting. So we know we can do these kind of things, and we know, and you know better than me, how we do that through economic development. How do we do that through business engagement? So, Call to Action 92 is the one I think speaks to all of us in this area. But we need to make that commitment to implement for the next 20 years. We ask ourselves questions about what will Canada look like 20 years from now, when you or your successors have another 20th anniversary meeting to make it 40 years. We stand here commemorating 150 years of Canada's history. But don't forget, it's also a 140-year anniversary of Treaty 6. No one is talking about that. So it's important we bring that into the discussion as well. What kind of skills will our children need 20 years from now to contribute to society? What kind of skills will they need? So we need to think about that, I think. So let me thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Also, let me thank you and congratulate you for all the work you've done. I know it's not easy for you because of the, ironically, it shouldn't be as difficult as it is, because the UN Declaration, the treaties, they're solutions. So is economic development. Economic development is a solution. And yet, I know you have difficulties getting support in that work. But keep it up. We heard this morning that our brother, as we laid him to rest, his last words to a couple of the members of the family, especially the incoming chief, was, don't give up. Don't give up. Those were the last words he left, and I share them with you because the greatness of that man who said change, like reconciliation, begins with me, begins with all of us individually. So thank you.